So the last section in this chapter is the quadratic formula. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do is move everything to one side. Then the quadratic formula itself is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. There's lots of songs on YouTube that you can look up for this. You can sing it along to Pop Goes the Weasel. But this is a formula you want to memorize like forever and always. So in my first example, I want to move everything to one side. So I'm going to take both of these things and move them over here. Okay, so that's going to give me 4r squared plus 6r minus 108. Now, what I would do, especially if you're new at this, is to label this A, B, and C. So now literally all you're doing is plugging this stuff into the equation above. So negative b, the opposite of b is going to be negative 6, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So 6 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Okay, so that looks long, but everything underneath the square root, you could just solve all at one time. You can put that in your calculator all at once. So then you're going to get negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 1,764 all over 8. Okay, so then you're going to check in your calculator and see if 1,764 has a perfect square root. Well, in fact, it does. The square root of that is actually 42. So this is going to be negative 6 plus 42 over 8 and negative 6 minus 42 over 8. So we just took this plus or minus sign and we broke it up into two separate problems. So when we do that, the first one is going to give us 36 over 8, which can't be divided nicely, but it can reduce. They're both divisible by 4. If you divide them by 4, you get 9 halves. So that's your first answer. And then this one is going to give you a negative 48 over 8. And 48 over 8 is negative 6. So those are your two solutions to that. So looking at number 2, doing the same thing, we need to move this. It's going to go right here in the middle. So that's going to give us 2x squared minus 12x minus 110 equals 0. Label these A, B, and C. And now we're going to plug into the equation, the opposite of b. So it's already a negative 12, so the opposite is a positive 12, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 12 squared. It's really, really important that you put it in just like that, because if you're going to do this all in one step in your calculator, you have to have the parentheses around that. If you don't have the parentheses, then it's going to think that it's a negative 144 instead of positive. So then minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Okay, so again, I'm going to go ahead and solve everything under the square root in the same thing. And that's going to give me 1,024 over 4. So 1,024 actually has a square root. Its square root is 32. So then I have 12 plus 32 over 4 and 12 minus 32 over 4. So 12 plus 32 is going to give you 44 over 4, which is 11. Then when I take 12 minus 32, I get negative 20 divided by 4, which is negative 5. And those are your two solutions. So those are two examples where it works out perfectly. So you probably could have factored for those. These next two are not going to work out perfectly, and you would not have been able to factor for these. So first step is to move everything to one side. Label A, B, and C. Put into my equation. So the opposite of b, right now I have 1n, so negative 1, plus or minus the square root of 1 squared minus 4 times 12 times negative 14 all over 2 times 12. So I have negative 1 plus or minus the square root of, underneath my square root is 673. And then my denominator is going to be 24. Okay, well, 673 does not have a perfect square root. It actually turns out that this is prime. It's a prime number. So your final answer to this is just that. That's how you're going to leave it, is just that. Same thing over here. Move that all to the same side. So 9a squared plus 6a minus 2 is equal to 0. So this is your a, b, and c values. So opposite of b is negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So when I solve this, I get negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 108 all over 18. And I know that 108 can break down. So 108 is 2 and 54, which is 9 and 6, 3 and 3, 2 and 3. Okay, so what I know is I have a couple of 3s, and I have a couple of 2s, and this guy is single. So the negative 6 stays where it's at, the 18 stays there, and the plus or minus. But now I have 3 times 3 on the outside. So this is 3 times 2 root 3. So this is really 6 square root 3. The last thing that I can do is I can look at my outside numbers and say these all divide by 6. So if you divide those by 6, I get negative 1 plus or minus 1 root 3. Well, 1 root 3 is just the square root of 3. And then 18 divided by 6 is 3. So then that is your final answer. And that's the quadratic formula, which you can use the quadratic formula 100% of the time always, even if it's factorable. Like this is going to give you an answer 100% of the time.